Okay, welcome to our snow day makeup lectures. This is the first of two, which will wrap up Rembrandt's paintings. There'll also be a tutorial on formatting to the Chicago style that will go up later after these lectures. We left off talking about Rembrandt. We're going to try and wrap up Rembrandt in these two lectures. We left him in Amsterdam, and in only about 5 years, really only in a few years of being in Amsterdam, Rembrandt has really arrived. He's almost immediately in Rembrandt, in Amsterdam, one of the most in-demand portraitists in the city. He's getting portrait commissions from very important patrons. In addition to that, he's getting commissions for history pictures. This is the kind of important commission that existed in very small numbers in Holland in the 17th century. And Rembrandt, as we saw at the end of class last time, had received a major commission from Prince Frederick Hendrik, the stateholder in The Hague, for a series of 5 pictures. He'd also married up the social ladder. His wife Saskia brought a huge inheritance to Rembrandt's family. He used her money to buy a huge house, what is today the Rembrandt House Museum, and he had enlisted an extraordinarily large number of students. Everything was going really well for Rembrandt by around 1635, 1636. Everything was going swimmingly. But then, unfortunately, Saskia took very, very ill, his wife Saskia. She was increasingly bedridden for over 5 years, beginning around 1637 or so. We think today, although it wasn't diagnosed at the time, that she probably had tuberculosis. She died in 1642, sadly, only 30 years old when she passed away. Rembrandt documented her illness in a number of drawings, prints as well, that show her declining health, and really also to a certain degree reveal Rembrandt's humanity, his knowledge of the human condition, and his ability to convey that in often very simple and quickly sketched forms. The bedroom where she was ill and bedridden survives in the Rembrandt house in the museum, and we'll visit it while we're there. But here's most likely the bed that Rembrandt illustrates in the drawing in the Rijksmuseum on the left, and we'll have a chance to see this drawing as well, since it's all of his works will be on display. The same year that Saskia died, Rembrandt got another major commission for a group portrait. Remember, we had looked at Dr. Tulp before. This is a group portrait of one of the 7 military guard units of Amsterdam. And it was originally commissioned to be placed in their meeting house, a recently rebuilt house for all 7 of the military guards, and each one of the groups would have a group portrait in this building. The Cloveniers Doelen, which we can see in the print on the left. Unfortunately, it's not there anymore, but part of the foundation walls have been built into this hotel, which is open to the public, and if you're into this sort of thing, you can go have tea at the hotel that stands on the site where the night watch was originally placed. Now, it's a group portrait, and so each member of the group, each member of the military guild, paid for their own inclusion. The drummer, who you see in the corner of the detail, apparently got in for free. They didn't charge him because he was a mundane employee, didn't have as much money as the other guild members. Each paid a different scale, and I get a feeling that the guy behind the arm, this fellow here, probably paid less. I certainly hope he did in any event. But as each of the members paid to be included, they also paid so that the 2 leaders of the guild would not have to pay. They also got in for free. They footed the bill for the leaders. And the leaders are, on the left, Frans Koch, the captain of the guild, and his lieutenant, Willem van Rautenberg, on the right. And they are the focal point of the group. The group is really arranged around them. They're in the brightest lit area of the entire composition. They're stepping forward. The three-dimensional effect of this is really quite strong. Both the hand of Koch and the staff of Rautenberg really seem to proceed directly into our space, and you'll get that effect when we're there. Remember that this is quite a large picture. I sort of blew by that picture of it in situ in the Rijksmuseum. But the figures that you see here are at least life-size. The ones in the foreground are. And it has a really quite a dramatic effect. In fact, to this day, it's one of the most beloved pictures, really, in all of the Netherlands. So what makes it stand out is a huge innovation on the part of Rembrandt, the innovation that we also saw in the Dr. Tulp painting, which is that he adds an action. He adds a sequence of events, if you will, to what had been traditionally a very stiff sort of composition, group portraits that had been around since the early part of the 16th century in the Low Countries. And on the norm, the tradition was just to line everybody up, sometimes in dual lines, but just sort of pose them. And even though Frans Hals is very good about making these poses very lively, they're still posed. They're not really doing anything. And Rembrandt, on the other hand, shows a very particular activity. He shows Captain Koch giving the marching orders. He's rallying the troops to gather together to go guard the city. And each participant responds with a particular activity. Now, it's not meant to be taking place at night. That's just Rembrandt's ongoing influence from Caravaggio that we see here. And in fact, even the color scheme of oranges and yellows and browns comes directly out of Caravaggio. Even though he'd probably only ever seen one in his lifetime, he's picking it up from other Dutch artists who had traveled to Italy. And so the Night Watch is really, it's a misnomer, right? It's really the company of Frans Banning Koch marching off together to guard the city. Now, in order to get this military group doing their thing, Rembrandt did some research. He went back and got an old, not that old, a relatively older manual on how to handle arms, something that was published in 1608. And he uses the illustrations from this How to Handle Your Gun book. That's basically what it's called, the Wapenhandelinge, How to Handle Your Weapons. And here we see the man in the engraving seen from the back loading his gun. But Rembrandt's figure does exactly the same thing, imagined from 180 degrees in reverse. We then see behind Rautenberg, we see a man that's blowing gunpowder off, the excess gunpowder from his gun, and he's very attentive, he's very careful, he's holding his gun carefully, putting it away from everybody, and blowing the gunpowder off of the firing pin, which is again alluded to or illustrated in this 1608 manual on handling arms. And then we have a third person. He's kind of hard to see back there. He's not really a portrait. It's a figure in a helmet with some leaves on top of the helmet as if sort of an honorific. Directly behind Frans Banning Koch, and he's firing his weapon. And you can see him back there. Right, here's his head, and then the weapon is there. And this is also taken directly, his pose, striding forward, is taken directly out of the manual on how to handle your weapons. So he's used that for many of the figures that appear here. An interesting detail that's easy to miss, and Rembrandt, I think, kind of sneaks it in here, is that he's misfiring his weapon. And I think this is why he's not a portrait. If you look at the gun and look at the tip of the gun, you can see a flame coming out of it, and then the smoke sort of melds with the feather in Rautenberg's hat and scares the guy directly behind him, who raises his hand in alarm, maybe even trying to push that gun away to save the lieutenant from having his head blown off. I think this is Rembrandt's sense of humor showing up again. It shows up often in his works, that as he's added this action, we have two people who are handling their arms properly, and one of them, who's not a portrait, mishandling his. So it really does elevate the status of the other two. And it points to some other things I wanted to add about some of the figures that appear here amid the members of the military unit. Um, Directly beneath the drummer, who we saw on the right hand panel, is a dog, and the drummer and the dog also add to the sense of sound that's alluded to by the blast of that gun behind the head of the lieutenant. Again, Baroque pictures really try to appeal to all of our senses. It's something we've talked about many times over. On the left-hand border, there's a dwarf, uh, also not a portrait, but he's carrying in his hands a huge horn that's used for ammunition. He's the ammunition bearer, and some have suggested that part of the narrative is that he's running off to get more gunpowder. It's interesting that his helmet is oversized for his small head, and again, I think this is Rembrandt and his, in this case, somewhat demeaning sense of humor with that with the dwarf wearing one of the soldiers' helmets. And then in the background, something I'd never seen until just this year. It seems to be Rembrandt himself peeking out from the back behind the other figures. If you can't see it, it's this detail right in there. It certainly does look very similar to many of his self-portraits. He loved wearing hats, and the face and the nose seem close enough for me, at least, to think that Rembrandt has actually snuck himself in there as well. The last figure to discuss in this is another well-highlighted figure behind our principals. There's a woman there amid this all-male militia guild, and she's highlighted directly behind the glove of friends Ben and Cook. And she's wearing a dead chicken tied to her belt, and down below what appears to be maybe a coin purse, perhaps. And who is this woman? What is she doing here? Well, on a certain level, she really does look like Saskia. A lot of people try to play this down, but I can't get over the fact that the sort of moon face looks very much like Rembrandt's wife, who had recently died. And that might account for why she's not particularly portrait-like, although Rembrandt kept portraits of Saskia. But this is the year that she would pass away, and she appears sort of ghostly back there, almost lit and heavenly, in this fantastic costume. And Rembrandt has a number of pictures where he dresses Saskia up in fantastic costumes. In this case, my inset photo here from London, Saskia is dressed as the Roman goddess of flowers, Flora. And in our picture, she's dressed up also in fantastic costume. So the question is, if it's based on Saskia, is this just Rembrandt sticking her there because she's dead, just as he stuck himself in, looking over the shoulders of those figures in the back? Or is there more to it? I think, really, she's highlighted very much like the two principal figures, and she wears the exact same colors as the lieutenant, who is wearing his official colors of the guild. And so there's a connection being drawn between her and the leaders of the guild. And I think this is a clue as to what Rembrandt intended her as. She is indeed probably a personification, an allegorical figure. She's the embodiment of the spirit of the group. And the way that we know that is that chicken that's tied to her waist. This was in fact the coat of arms of this particular militia guild. Here are some other governors painted at a different time of this militia guild, and you can see in the upper left corner there's a chicken claw on a medallion on the wall in their meeting room. This is exactly what Rembrandt has incorporated into the costume of the woman. So this suggests to us that what she is the military spirit, the great spirit of service of the group itself, that just as he's enlivened the group portrait, he's found a way to incorporate their armorial device, their coat of arms, if you will, into the picture in a rather interesting way. In the same way that the horn that the dwarf carries seems very similar to the horn being carried by one of the governors here. Well, there is a myth about the Night Watch that it was ill received, that it was rejected because it was not in keeping with the traditional style of portraits, where you just see people sort of sitting around and posing, like the Govard Flink on your left. But this is simply not true. It wasn't rejected at all, and in fact, it was really well received. In fact, it was praised when it came out. One contemporary quote after Rembrandt finished it said, because remember, this hung in the room with at least 7 other group portraits, and people looked at it and said, "This is different. This is great." And one person wrote, "It will outlive all its competitors, being so painterly in conception, so daring in invention, and so powerful that, as some people feel, all the other paintings stand beside it like decks of playing cards." Right? In other words, they see them as stiff as the kings and queens that you see in a pack of cards, because Rembrandt has really brought uh, the this group portrait to life. Even though The Night Watch was well received, for one reason or another, in the 1640s and 1650s, Rembrandt's prominent commissions begin to dry up, and he seems to fall on increasingly hard times after the death of Saskia. I mean this monetarily in particular. He gets fewer and fewer commissions. They seem to be limited to a small number of very loyal patrons, but public commissions seem to disappear in the 1640s. And some of this may have had to do with his lifestyle, which was perceived as being dissolute. He was uh, living a sort of a life that was the subject of some judgment from people outside. And I want to talk about that very briefly. The year after Saskia died, Rembrandt hired a wet nurse to look after his and Saskia's son. He had only one child who lived beyond sort of first years of childbirth, and this was his son Titus. And he outlived Saskia, obviously. And in 1643, Rembrandt hired a wet nurse to looked after Titus, because Saskia is now dead. Her name was Gertje Dirks, and they began to have an affair in Rembrandt's house. She was living in Rembrandt's house because she was looking after Titus, but this turned into a amorous relationship. And Rembrandt couldn't marry her because of Saskia's prenup, if you will. Remember that she had brought this huge inheritance to Rembrandt, and if it was written by her family that if Rembrandt were to remarry, he would lose the inheritance. He would have to give it back to the family. But he could keep it so long as he had an offspring, and it would then go to the offspring. The family would let it go to Titus. Right? So if he married Gertje Dirks, he would have to pay back Saskia's dowry, and he'd spent most of it, so he couldn't do that. So he and Gertje lived together without being married. Then around 1654, he met another woman, Hendrikje Stoffels, and began a relationship with her. Needless to say, this means he broke up with Gertje Dirks, and at first it seems to have worked out okay. He gave her a settlement sum plus an annual stipend to look after her. He didn't leave her penniless. However, the money turned out not to be enough for her, and she kept demanding more and more money. And in 1649, 2 years after the breakup, Gertje sued Rembrandt for breach of promise. She said he had promised to marry her, and he did not. And this went to court. And the court had him increase the amount of the annual stipend. But eventually, what Rembrandt did, and this doesn't paint Rembrandt in a very good light, in order to avoid paying the extra sum, he was able to get her locked up in an insane asylum in the city of Gouda, where the cheese comes from. And then he turned around and charged her family for actually taking her to the asylum. This got him out of that agreement and got him free to be with Hendrikje Stoffels. Like I said, Rembrandt doesn't come off smelling so good in all of this. part of it is that you don't have to be a great person to make great art, sadly. And Rembrandt here does not show his best stripes. He and Hendrikia continued to live out of wedlock until her death in 1663 during an outbreak of the plague. In 1654, Hendrikia is pregnant with a daughter, and at the point that Hendrikia gets pregnant, she's living with Rembrandt. She gets actually called before a church council. And the church council charges her, and these are the exact words of the charge, that she was committing the acts of a whore with Rembrandt the painter. And the church excommunicated her. She could no longer take communion. Right? And so Rembrandt is living a lifestyle that's coming increasingly under judgment. Interestingly enough, in 1655, the year after this excommunication, Titus came of age, which means the money could stay with Titus and stay in his family. And Rembrandt could, in fact, have married Hendrikia. He actually pulled a fast one. He got Titus to declare Rembrandt as Titus's heir, his son's heir, so the money would stay in the family. He's free to marry Hendrikia. He never does, all the way up until her death. So again, it's not his shining moment in the ethical spotlight. But what the whole point of going through all of this biography is to point to the fact that these social problems that I'm talking about may have helped lead to Rembrandt's economic downfall. People may have stayed away from him because his reputation is in fact increasingly being called into question. He eventually goes broke. 2 years after Hendrikia's problems with the church, Rembrandt declares bankruptcy, 1656. A inventory is drawn up of everything he owns to determine all of his assets. Many of those things he's forced to sell off, everything except what he needs to make art. He's even forced to sell that big house he had bought with the Rembrandt house, the one he had bought with Saskia's inheritance. All of this happens in 1656. Rembrandt is really on a downward trajectory in the 40s and the 50s. He's saved, it appears, by Hendrikia Stoffels. She and Titus, they've moved off to the outskirts of Amsterdam. They're renting a house. And Hendrikia and young Titus, who's about 14 at this point, open a business. And the business is exclusively to sell Rembrandt's art. And this seems to have helped to get him back on his financial feet. We think that Hendrikia's business acumen actually had a hand in reviving Rembrandt's career in the late 1550s. Here we see one of his most famous works from the early 1660s, a commission, another group portrait commission, probably arranged by Hendrikia Stoffels. Her business acumen helping again Rembrandt to get back into the picture, so to speak. And the Syndics of the Drapers Guild is to this day also one of Rembrandt's best known works. Part of this is because of Madison Avenue. It became the logo on the Dutch Masters cigar boxes. I remember growing up with these. Some of my first art supply boxes were Dutch Masters cigar boxes. Not that I smoked good cigars or my dad or anything. They were just kind of cool boxes to have with a Rembrandt on them. But our painting has absolutely nothing to do with tobacco. The Syndics of the Drapers Guild inspected the quality of dyed wool in the city. They had to do with the guild, which of wool drapers, people who bought and sold bolts of woolen fabric. Part of these regulations, they're very much like a trade union today. They would have not only prevented people from trading wool in Amsterdam who didn't belong to the guild, but they also put very, very strict rules on the quality of the wool. And so the syndics would meet 3 times a week to inspect samples of wool to make sure that the wool sold in Amsterdam, anywhere in the city, met their standards and was of a high enough quality. Notice in the foreground there's that great woolen tablecloth draped over the table coming out almost into our space. And again, Rembrandt enlivening the portrait as they all turn to greet us. They've taken off their gloves on the right. One of them rises to meet us. He puts his finger in his account book. Uh, and they're interested in our presence, and they're reacting to the fact that we are here. So Rembrandt is still making these extraordinarily wonderful innovations within the portrait genre. Now, what we see, of course, is one of these meetings where they met 3 times a week to inspect cloth samples. And in fact, the painting was hung in the hall where they actually did the inspections. This leads us to think that the book that we see in the painting probably replicated a book that they were using in the building as well. And he's gesturing to it, they're inspecting it, and this is now their account book, where they're marking down who brought the fabric in, and also how much it was valued at, and the level of quality of that book, or of that wool. Rembrandt's late works become increasingly open in the way he handles paint, and yet at the same time become increasingly more expressive in the way he handles the human psyche. He continues to do pictures of his family, and again continues to dress them up in various kinds of costumes, to pictures of young Titus at age roughly 13, 14 on your left. 5 years later, end of his teens on your right, dressed up as maybe St. Francis, certainly as a Franciscan monk. But in each of them, Rembrandt showing off on a certain level things that are great about Rembrandt. Three-dimensional qualities, the way things exist in space, that's never without question, but also sort of psychological insight. In addition to that, here in the 50s and 60s, we see Rembrandt's looser application of paint, more expressive application of paint. The front of that desk on your left, for example, if you look more closely, you can see these swaths of orange and red and blue and gray, handled almost impressionistically. On the right, the picture of the monk, if we look at the area of landscape behind the monk's hood, you can see it's sort of been mottled and dabbled at. And I've got some details of other works coming up that really illustrate that. Self-portraits continue to hold a strong position in Rembrandt's career. And at the same time he's doing self-portraits, he's also doing portraits of religious figures that have been isolated from any narrative details, just single figures. St. Paul pondering as he composes the New Testament. St. Paul was martyred by a sword, and so his attribute, the way we can identify St. Paul, is from the prominent inclusion of that sword, which you can see on the right border of the National Gallery picture on the right. And you can see kind of subtly tucked in the shadow in the self-portrait that there's indeed a sword there as well. So his self-portrait in the guise of the Apostle Paul. Fascinating as well, because we talked at the very beginning of our discussion of Rembrandt of how much he's interested in the theme of blindness. And St. Paul, if you know this or not, was originally Saul of Tarsus, the persecutor of the Jews. And he was converted by having been struck blind and miraculously cured. And here's Rembrandt as the man who was blind but now can see. These self-portraits become these sort of unflinching, unvarnished, not airbrushed insights into the painter's character and how he truly looked. He's not the most handsome of fellows, bulbous at best, and his paintings almost accentuate that. The one nod to vanity is the hats. We're pretty sure he was bald on top with that bozo haircut, and the hats simply cover up the place where he doesn't have much hair. But at the same time, when we look at these portraits, we look at them closely, we see, I think, some of the ravages of Rembrandt's life. He'd gone through a heck of a lot by 61. The one on your right is from the last year of his life. right? Already by 61, he'd seen his first wife die, he'd seen most of his children die, he'd gone bankrupt, he'd lost most of his patrons, right? He'd seen his son and his common law partner, if you will, Hendrikia, have to come to his rescue, open a business to keep him afloat. Um, Things weren't going well for him, and I think some of the ravages of that time is why he's a mere 56 on the left, and looks significantly older than that. But he's again doesn't try to clean himself up. He doesn't try to show himself as anything that he isn't. And this humanity that he brings to the self portraits, and really he brings to all of his works, and it comes out particularly strong in the works that he does at the end of his life. On the left, in Russia, The Return of the Prodigal Son is one of his most famous works, where the son has gone out, spent his entire fortune, is now being welcomed back by his father as he returns after having lived an indolent lifestyle, and is now coming back and is accepted. And you can see the other son in the background who stayed around, jealously looking on as the father accepts the son back as if he had done nothing wrong. This great parable that Christ tells of the power of God's forgiveness. And Rembrandt focusing on that embrace, the humility of the son. He's lost one of his shoes, the other one has no heel. His feet are bruised and dirty. His head's been shaven probably because of lice. And the father doesn't care about any of that. Doesn't care how dirty and smelly and pest-ridden his son is. He accepts him back. And there's the other son in the background, jealously looking on. I've been here all along. I've been good. How can you do that? What we'll see at the Rijksmuseum on the right, another of his most beloved works, an image of Isaac and Rebecca. And again, they've been so isolated from any kind of narrative context, which is something Rembrandt does a lot, that it picked up a nickname of the Jewish bride, although that's just kind of its nickname. It really probably is a image of the wedding of the betrothal of Isaac and Rebecca. And I wanted to end with this, when we're talking about Rembrandt's paintings at least, to simply look at the paint. I was in Amsterdam in October, and I was just struck by the quality of paint. I knew this picture. It's one of those ones you just, from Rembrandt's work, it's one of the 5 or so that you know. But when I got there, I was dumbstruck by how beautiful the paint application is. I want to show you some details, right? Here's Rebecca's sleeve, and you can see what Rembrandt's doing is he's kind of breaking all of the rules. In fact, it looks almost as if parts of this are not painted with a brush at all, but that he's going in with his palette knife, the little spatula that he uses to mix the paint on the palette. And he's coming back in and he's scratching some of it in. The edge of that silk sleeve, we can see some of the brush strokes, certainly made with a brush, but some of it, even, for example, this bit right here, almost looks like it was made with his fingers, as if he's like dipping them in the wet paint and dragging them around. But then if we look at this area here, you get the sense of how he sort of scraped into it with his palette knife. And everywhere we look, the paint quality is first, it's extraordinarily thick. And it's extraordinarily loose in its applications. And these are things that Rembrandt's doing at the end of his career, and that buildup of paint with these oranges right up in this area here. The oranges and the yellows and the grays coming together, layer upon layer. It looks like it could have been painted in New York in the 1950s. It has that sort of abstract expressionist quality. That's simply extraordinary. He really is doing things that nobody else has. Here, I think this has been scraped with the palette knife after some of the paint is drawn, and it's given us this surface that almost looks like it's a rubbing of something else. Again, it's almost like it's a technique you couldn't figure out on your own, but there are areas that are most certainly scraped, that bit right there. But other areas that look like they're scraped as the paint has been half dried. One more detail of this to wrap up our discussion of Rembrandt's paintings, where we can see more of this thick paint that he then cuts back into, right? So we can see things like just down in here where it's quite obviously been scraped at with his palette knife. But then this area up in here where it looks as if he's been cutting at it almost with the edge of something, maybe again the edge of that palette knife, breaking all of the rules. And the idea here is I think that the painting itself becomes this sort of signature of Rembrandt. No one else painted like this. His students might paint like this for a bit when they were studying with him, but they might go out on their own, they'd do something else, they'd do their own thing. Rembrandt has a particular Rembrandt quality. And, you know, some artists are hugely overrated. Rembrandt isn't. He's a phenomenal painter in his understanding of the medium and his ability to experiment with it.